The following program is a Town of Colonie television production of the William K. Sanford Town Library.
Thanks. Thank you all for coming, especially on the day. This is the day the Lord hath made. It's a day that it's not really good to talk about disaster. It's kind of a downer, but you know, what the hell, we'll do it anyway. Excuse me, did I use the word hell? I'm sorry. You can delete that there, Greg. Thanks for coming, and thanks for Joe for inviting me again. I'm going to go through this in a way, very summarily. I'm going to explain quickly what the book is about. Then I'll explain why I wrote the book. And then I'll go into more detail as to what the book is about. So it's going to be what, why, and what. All right? Now, can everyone hear me all right? You can all right? Okay. The book is about the 311, and the Japanese refer to it as 311, because it's March 11th, 2011, triple disaster, which is the only one of its kind in history. It's a disaster in which we had a 9.0 magnitude earthquake, we have a massive tsunami, and we have a nuclear meltdown further south. So it all told, it exacted about 18,000 deaths, lives, and still there are about over 2,000 people missing. Now, there are also a fourth disaster. The fourth disaster is the plight of the survivors who are now still living in temporary shelters. And I worked with them as a volunteer in 2014 during my sabbatical. They're still in their units, and they're having a real tough time. About 120, 150,000. And further south, we have a fifth disaster, also survivors who've been forced to evacuate from their cities because of the nuclear radiation. So they're still living elsewhere. They're displaced. They have to leave their towns immediately. And they suffer the stigma of being from Fukushima. So just being from Fukushima labels them as being irradiated. So this is a really tough plight, especially for kids, when kids go to different schools and then their classmates find out that they're from Fukushima. So all sorts of unfounded rumors about their being contaminated. So there are basically 5 disasters. This was the worst disaster in Japan since Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And hopefully it'll never happen again anywhere in the world. And my book is about how the Japanese have faced this and how they still continue to recover from this. And make no doubt about it, recovery is still taking place. There's no recovery. It's still an ongoing situation, which astounds me given the fact that Tokyo is preparing for the 2020 Summer Olympics. And that's a whole nother story as well. So that's what my book is about in a nutshell. Now, why did I write this book? Well, my mother's Japanese. That's my mom when she was 19. She didn't know any better then. To marry my father, who was Irish American. He was a GI. And that's before they were married. He was a GI stationed in Japan. This was towards the tail end of the Korean War. As you know, the Americans, the military was stationed in Japan in various bases. And I was born. I was born there as a result of their passion. Their passion for each other, given the fact that my father knew no Japanese whatsoever. My mother knew no English whatsoever. So I suppose the lesson in that is lust is a universal language. And I was born as a result of that lust. And so were my twin sisters, who were born a couple of years later. So we lived in Japan for about 5 years, actually. So Japanese is my first language. So we moved to America when I was 5. We moved to Newport, Rhode Island. And why did we go to Newport, Rhode Island? Because that's where my father's parents were from. That's where they lived, because they settled in Newport from Ireland. A lot of Irish are in Newport. They just had the St. Paddy's Day Parade this past Saturday. I was there for that. And that's a big deal. That's the day. And the Irish settled in Newport because they worked for the wealthy people. They worked in farms, and they worked fishing, and they worked for the wealthy people in the mansions. So that's what my grandparents did. So in any case, I'm deeply interested in the interchange between cultures. In this case, it's Irish and Japanese, Japanese-Irish, and I'm still trying to come up with a drink that mixes Guinness Stout, not blonde, the real Guinness Stout, and sake. So if you can come up with a good concoction, I think we'll come up with a good drink there. Maybe patent it, right? Anyway, I wrote this book because when my mom passed away in 2009, and this hit Japan in 2011, it certainly affected me because my cousins, my family on my mom's side are all back there. And I still go there every other year. So I made a promise to my mom that I would learn more about this and share what I've learned with others. So I went back a number of times. I went in 2012 for a few months. I visited the devastated areas. It was really eye-opening. This is a picture from my visit in 2012. This is the city of Otsuchi, which is along the coast. But this is the town square, which is about 4 miles from the ocean. 4 miles. And it's wiped out. The waves reached inland as far as 6 miles. So that's a long way, right? Now what's interesting is that there's the hospital there, the white building that's still standing. And the subtitle of my book, well, it's not a subtitle, it's called Japan's March 2000 Disaster and Moral Grit. And my book is really about what I think of as moral grit, because that's the key to recovery. An example of moral grit were the doctors and the nurses who worked in the hospital. And then on that day, 2:46 in the afternoon, the earthquake occurred, the rumbling occurred, lasted for about 6 minutes, even in Tokyo. And they knew that water was coming. But they didn't know it was going to reach them that far inland. But the doctors and nurses who were not on call, who lived in higher ground, you see up here, right? Higher ground, which is always a safe place to be for a tsunami, they immediately went to see their patients. They went to see them, to be with them, and every one of them were wiped out. So that's an example of moral grit. That's an example of doing what you have to do, even in the face of risk. Another reason I wrote the book is because I feel that anything like this should only be written by someone who's been on the ground. And the only lessons we can learn, I love this quote from Nietzsche: "All that is written, I love only what a person has written with his own blood." Now, I've taught medical ethics throughout my career. And this really resonates with me, because for me, the real lessons that I've learned, and I think that we as doctors and nurses and others, our real lessons come from the patients, from the people who are suffering. Those are our teachers. And you know as well as I that to live is to suffer. And it's what we can learn from those who do suffer can teach us invaluable lessons. So that's all the more reason why I wanted to meet the survivors, those who've lost family members, those city officials who were involved in recovery. Meet with the survivors, get into try to understand what they experienced, and then learn from that, and then share their stories with others. And that's what I did in my writing. This is what my book is all about. It's about a sharing of the stories of people whom I met, survivors, who've in my opinion, embodied moral grit. And I worked as a volunteer in 2014 during my sabbatical. Now, let me quote from the book. Let me quote from here. It's all about my volunteering, and I volunteered during my sabbatical. When we reached a point in our lives when another's suffering means little to us, we further erased any possibility of redemption. It's the suicide of our soul. For me, and I believe for many of us who were volunteering in Tohoku, that's the area that was hit by the tsunami, our work was a sort of gateway to healing. And by healing, I mean transforming the mere intellectual knowing about the disaster and its wake of suffering and lingering aftermath into an acknowledging of that horror. To acknowledge is the bread of conversion. Such is what we shared, our common ground as volunteers, particularly for me as an academic, even worse as a philosopher. And we have a reputation for having both feet firmly planted in the air. Academic colleagues have asked me after my sabbatical, so what did you do in your sabbatical? What was your research about? What did you read? And many stared back quizzically when I answered, well, I read little. I worked my butt off as a volunteer in Tonomagakoro, spending cold, windy, and rainy days shoveling snow and mud, moving rocks, splitting wood, cleaning rooms, cleaning windows, setting up temporary platforms, and helping survivors. All in all, working most of the time in snow, mud, and debris. I was not caged in a book written by others about others. Nor was I isolated in my office, reflecting on third-hand accounts. Rather than weave around me that safe net of cognitive empathy, I wish to see for myself the current plight of survivors and feel their circumstances on the ground. So that's why I volunteered, because I wanted to learn more about it in what I think is the right way. Now, my subtitle is called Our Inescapable In-Between. And let me explain that very briefly. The Japanese character for human being is at the bottom. It's called ningen. And it's comprised of two characters. One character, this one here, means individual, hito, individual. This character here, right, that means in between. So the Japanese believe that each one of us is not only an individual, unique person, but we are inherently embedded in a geography of relationship. It's inescapable. We are in between, whether we like it or not. I am my father's son. I am my sister's brother, my student's teacher, my friend's friend. It's that space in between me and my friend, John Thornton. That space joins us, does not separate us. That space between John and me joins us, does not separate us. And the same can be said for our situatedness in our climate, our physical environment. We are inescapably in between and related to the climate that we live in. In fact, there are two kinds of climate. There's the physical climate, which is the weather, right? We face weather every day. Put on the Weather Channel. What's going to happen today, this week, or down the road, which is climate. And wherever we live, if we live on the coast, we face the hazards of living by the sea. If we live in the mountains, we live the hazards of living by the mountains. We're indelibly situated in this geography and topography, whether we like it or not. And I believe that how we look at life, how we look at reality and other people and things is going to be affected by that climate. You know, when you're in a desert climate, water takes on a different meaning. When you're living by the ocean, water takes on a different meaning. It can be life-giving, it can also be crushing, right? It can pull us out. So we are situated in that physical climate, but we're also inescapably situated in our relationships, where we come from, our parents, their parents, our children, their children, our friends, etc. That's part of that's who we are. So for us, we have a dual identity of being individuals, but also relational. And I believe that in this day and age, we're a little bit more consumed with this and less consumed with that. You know, we're a little bit more consumed with ourselves and less concerned and even aware. And for many of my students, they don't even care about the other. And that to me is frightening. So the day, not St. Patrick's Day, but the day, March 11th for the Japanese, 3/11, we had three major events, as I said, two unfolding, continuing. So, okay, here's the epicenter, the earthquake. It's about 50 miles off the coast. 9.0 magnitude. The entire area here is ruptured. Roads are ruined in seconds. The Japanese are trained to know what to do in the case of an earthquake. I mean, after all, they do live, this whole island lives surrounded by the Pacific Ring of Fire and on top of fault lines, right? That's our natural climate, it's inescapable. The Japanese experience over 1,500 tremors or earthquakes a year. That's a lot. Whenever I'm there, I'm always feeling something. That's not after drinking sake. I know there's some rumbling taking place, and just gentle rumbling, but it doesn't last. But on that day, it lasted 6 minutes, and the rumbling became more and more violent. Even here in Tokyo. Tokyo has 33 million people in it. It's the largest city in the world. So if anything happens to Tokyo, That will be a catastrophe of major proportion. Think about the Summer Olympics in 2020. Then, that terrible friction between the tectonic plates, 18 miles deep into the sea, which we call a seaquake, not an earthquake, right? Technically, it's a seaquake. It spawns this amazing set of waves, which we call a train wave, a wave train. A tsunami is not just one wave. It's about 3 or 4 or 5 waves. It's called a wave train. And it's oftentimes a third wave, which is the killer, not the first. The first wave, and then there's a receding of the water. Then the second wave, which can be hard hitting. And the third wave can be really tough. In the Indian Ocean tsunami, a lot of tourists, a lot of people who lived there mistook the signs of the receding waters. They were astounded. The waters came in, and then the waters receded. So thousands of tourists, families, are out there picking up jellyfish, shells, and they were, of course, within minutes, they were wiped away. Right? So we have to know, all of this recovery requires that we be educated. We learn tsunami physics and earthquake physics. And most importantly, we have to learn the right mental attitude when we face these situations. So, excuse me. So the waves hit the shore, and they reach down here hundreds of miles. This is hundreds of miles now. It's about 200 miles. From the epicenter to Tokyo, it's about 200 miles. Fukushima, by the way, is here. So Fukushima is about 100 miles, 150 miles from Tokyo, 120 miles. Waves reach in here all along this coast, devastating these towns, wiping them off the map. Of course, the waves don't come right away. There's sufficient time for people, once they get the warning that the tsunami is coming, they have about 20, 30, 40 minutes, depending upon where the epicenter is, to get to higher ground. Now that's what's critical, is you have to go to higher ground. Fortunately, in that area, there's a lot of higher ground. And people, because it's a very mountainous area, mountainous and coastline. But for those who weren't able to go to higher ground in time, especially the elderly and the sick, the vulnerable, they were wiped out. Not only that, many who went to designated evacuation shelters, the shelters themselves were not strong enough to deal with the waves coming in. So there's a very famous Buddhist shelter, Buddhist evacuation center in Otsuchi, and hundreds of people went there believing that they'll be protected again by the Buddha. No. And when the wave comes in, it's not like clean water. It's not like if you're surfing, you get hit by a wave. We're talking about a massive black wall. It's a black wall that is the power of a locomotive. So basically, those in the shelters, those who are hit by the waves, don't know what hit them. And it's not just water. Imagine it's filled with debris. Torn wood, metal, ships, cars. So another part of the damage are the fires, because fuel from the ships collide with the cars, fuel, and then you have conflagrations everywhere. So then you have the terrible situation at Fukushima, Daiichi nuclear power plant. Let me read that to you. Minutes after the giant earthquake occurred, the massive tsunami swarmed easily over seawalls protecting the nuclear power plant. The seawalls are about 15 to 20 feet high, which experts from Tokyo Electric Power Company felt that this would be high enough because they made a very, very liberal estimate in terms of what they expected from a tsunami. They did not expect anything of this size, so we have waves over 40 feet. They easily breached over the walls, and then they flooded the nuclear sites, they flooded the basements, and the backup diesel generators are located where? In the basement, without any water containment protection. So they're flooded. There were backup batteries, banks of batteries, also in the lower levels. It's all flooded. So what happened was a complete power outage. Complete power outage. And when you read the accounts of what occurred over the next few days at the power plant, it's a nightmare. Because somehow or other, the water, what happens is that the water, to cool the fuel rods, now is no longer coming in. Why? Because the electricity is off. The power is off. So the fuel rods then melt. And when they melt, you have this intense heat that occurs, and then eventually it's so incredibly hot and the fuel rods are melted. What happens is that radiation is spewed up into the air, and then you have these series of explosions. And the plant had about 3 different explosions over the course of the next few days. So you had radiation spewing out into the atmosphere, into the groundwater, and into the sea. To make matters worse, we have what is called wind. See, we're embedded within the climate. You have the wind, and we're all familiar with wind. Some days we'll have really windy days, and that was a windy day. And you had the winds blowing northwest over the cities northwest of Fukushima. So we have that contamination, that radiation continuing on. Anyway, that was a nightmare, what took place at Fukushima. The lesson we can learn from Fukushima, in terms of recovery, we always need a backup to our backups. Always be prepared for the worst case scenario, in other words. And Fukushima, unfortunately, was not prepared for that worst case scenario, which was a complete power outage. They were not prepared for that. See, man is not the measure of all things. Nature is. Nature always wins in the long run. Now, in the areas near the nuclear power plant, I took these photos. I had other slides I wanted to show you, but then I realized that I was going to be filmed, and then I would have been committing something illegal by showing you slides that I did not make, that were just printed elsewhere, public. I don't think they're public domain, but I took these photos myself. So in my visit in 2012, I went to this town called Odaka, which is just about 12 miles outside of the nuclear power plant. I could not go in any further because they've been excluded from that because of the radiation. But this is an example of what's called a nuclear ghost town. I went back in 2014. Bikes are still there. No one's back in Odaka. Everyone was told, get on the buses that are coming your way, leave everything, and get out. So everyone left their possessions at home, got quickly on the buses. Kids left the schools. They left their buses there. These are school bikes. These are bikes that kids had. There's a school right nearby here, a junior high school. So the bikes are still there. And they're all gone. The people have left. So there are quite a few nuclear ghost towns like this in that area. Now, my book talks about the question of recovery. One of the questions we can ask is with this terrible situation, Is recovery even possible? Here's not uncommon story. This is a story about one of the many suicides that occurred. In the areas that were radiated. Home is not simply some space where one lives. I read about the meaning of home, for what it means, I think, for many of us. Home is not simply a space. Place matters. For Hamako Watanabe, home meant living in her home in Kawamata, Fukushima Prefecture, near here, and working together with her husband on their small chicken farm. 1 month after the nuclear disaster at the Daiichi nuclear power plant, her home, which was nearly 20,000 miles away from the plant, was declared an evacuation zone. She and her family were forced to leave, and they fled to an apartment in Fukushima City. The chicken farm, her livelihood, closed down. Since then, she became increasingly depressed and not able to see any light at the end of the tunnel. She lost all hope for returning home. After deep depression, in July 2011, 58-year-old Hamako went to her abandoned home, soaked herself in gasoline, and set herself on fire. So,
Excuse me, did you say 20,000 miles?
25 miles. 25 miles. Did I say 25, 20,000? 25 miles, I'm sorry. So this was not an uncommon scenario. There was an increase in suicides by those who were displaced. And I write about that, the meaning of home for us. A lot of young people don't get it. But for the elderly, home is not just a house. Where you live means a lot. So what we have in the Fukushima area, we have people who are displaced from their homes, but their kids, also displaced, now are forced to live where there's work. So they go to Tokyo or to Osaka or to Kobe or wherever to get work. And this becomes a problem for the elderly because now they're displaced from their own family. See, and they're not only displaced from where they live and what that meant to them, but also displaced from their family. So this is also a very significant issue, the notion of home and being displaced. In the light of all that, is recovery possible? That's the question. And in my opinion, recovery, and we can apply this to ourselves, think of Hurricane Andrew, etc., and more, because we will, in this life of uncertainty, one thing for certain is this, is that we will experience more intense weather and more extreme weather. That's a certainty. So the question is, how do we deal with that? How do we recover from it? Well, number one, and you all know this, recovery is not just survival. Recovery goes beyond survival. Think of a surgery one is about to undergo, right? It's oftentimes the case that recovery from surgery, not survival, but recovery rests upon how we are before the surgery, our state of health before the surgery, how healthy we are physically, how healthy we are mentally. A lot of it depends upon our attitude before surgery. It's hard to cultivate a positive attitude these days with our healthcare system, but we have to we owe it to ourselves to come up with positive attitude and stay healthy. Why? Because, and this is probably the most important theme in my book, how we are before the storm is going to determine how we are after the storm. before will lead to after. And recovery is more than survival. So, recovery requires, think of two things, defense and depth. Think of the Super Bowl, think of any great victory or anything like that. Defense, and you need depth. By defense, I mean having a strong physical infrastructure, being educated about that infrastructure. And by infrastructure, I mean access to roads, knowing the evacuation routes, being well educated, having a system in place, having proper planning among the different cities, the councils. Hospitals have their own surge capacity plans. Surge capacity means, and any hospital should have this today, especially with the pandemic scares we've been having about bird flu, etc. Basically, what happens when an emergency room is overcrowded? What do you do in that case? And that's called surge capacity. Right, surge capacity. So this is an example of physical infrastructure. Building higher seawalls, having access to higher ground, having buses available to take people out of their vicinity. That's all example of, and being educated about that. And not just being educated, as the Japanese children are not only educated about the physics of tsunamis, but they're educated about the physics of geography, of earthquakes. But they're also trained about the proper attitude in the case of a disaster. Every year, on September 1st, the Japanese have what's called Disaster Prevention Week. We don't have that in this country. We don't have we have a day for everything, but we don't have a day for disaster prevention. But the Japanese have to have that. And every week, they spend that entire week, September 1st, from having evacuation drills, earthquake drills, tsunami drills, etc. So the children know what to do in the case of a disaster. And more importantly, they're trained in the right attitude. The right attitude means not helter-skelter, not each for himself, but being orderly and looking out for the other and doing whatever one can do to help the other first. Okay? That's very, very important. It's not all for ourselves. It's not panic. And the worst thing we can do in a disaster, as we know, is panic. That's a physical infrastructure. That's part of our defense. But there's also the social infrastructure, which is just as important. And the social infrastructure is how are we as a community? Do we know our neighbors? Do we know if there are any elderly who live near us? Or any young children? Or single parents with young children? Or those who are disabled? You know? Do we know this? How are we willing to put their needs ahead of ours? That's the social vulnerability, the degree of social cohesion. And the Japanese, hundreds of thousands could have died from this. But the reason why many of them didn't was because of this social cohesion. And part of that social cohesion is what I refer to as moral grit. Moral grit. So we have to ask our question, how vulnerable are we? And here's the, if we can read this. By vulnerability, we mean the characteristics of a person or a group in terms of their capacity to anticipate, cope with, resist, and recover from the impact of a natural hazard. It involves a combination of factors that determine the degree to which someone's life and livelihood is put at risk by a discrete and an identifiable event in nature or society. Now, this refers to a natural hazard, but in my opinion, These days, there's probably no longer any such thing as a pure natural disaster. We have a combination, actually, of a natural and techno-societal hazards. Katrina is a good example of that. The hurricane is not what swamped and killed many people in New Orleans and Mississippi and Alabama. It wasn't the hurricane. It was the weak infrastructure, and particularly the seawalls. And these seawalls were put up, not fully prepared for a hurricane, and plus they were built in areas that were already overcome by development. So you had the destruction of natural barriers in that area by building human development, by communities. And what that does is weaken the natural barrier. So we can't blame it on an act of God. We use that phrase, acts of God. But it's acts of man and women, acts of humans, and what we do to our environment. And this is all part of it. A good example, again, is the nuclear power plant in Fukushima. Who would think of putting backup generators in the basements? Or having seawalls 15 to 20 feet high, which is not much, and or having, with the release of air pressure, in case the pressure inside the reactors becomes too intense, have them electrically powered. Well, what happens if the power goes out? See, a lot of the release of the valves had to be done by people. They're called the Fukushima 50, those who stayed behind, and they'll probably die because of their exposure to radiation. But they had to manually release the valves, the air pressure. Otherwise, you'd have a massive explosion leading to nuclear fission. Nuclear fission means that other plants are affected, and that means the rest of the world is affected. So they had to release the the radiation, the air, into the air. But they had to do this manually, and they could go in 17 minutes at a time at most, without maximum exposure. But most likely, these 50 will, they will suffer some effects of that down the road. And just about all of them were all over the age of 40, already had families. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But here's an example of the what I mean by physical infrastructure and social infrastructure and moral grid. This is the Unosami Elementary High School, which is in Kamaishi, and on the other side of this is a junior high school. When the earthquake occurred, the children who were taught all about earthquake physics knew that this was so bad that there are waves going to be coming their way. Teachers told the children to stay in their classrooms. Teachers did not know, they obviously didn't learn much about physics. Now, if they listened to the teachers, they wouldn't be here. The students, however, looked out the window and they saw the junior high school students behind this school. They saw the junior high school students heading for higher ground, all orderly. So the kids, the elementary kids, all ran out to join them. They said, heck with the teachers. They went out there to join them. They just knew this was the thing to do. And they didn't go out running out crazily or helter-skelter. They went in order. They went, right? Teachers realized, okay, they're probably doing the right thing. We'll do this. Teachers follow them. So they join together with the junior high school kids. And junior high school kids go to higher ground. Then the junior high school kids realize that this higher ground is probably not high enough. So they go even higher. And you can see back here? See, they go way up there, up in the hills. And thank God for all the kids in the elementary school and in the junior high school We were talking about over 300 elementary school students and over 200 junior high school students and over 30 teachers. All of them lived. And there are stories of the kids, and I remember speaking with the kids, and just about every kid, every junior high school kid, was holding someone else's hand or carrying a kid on their back or an elderly person, because the elderly people were living there too. So they were carrying them up the hill, and everyone survived. So in the town of Kamaishi, over 1,000 people died, but only 5 children died, which is remarkable, because that's remarkably low compared to the other towns. This is because the kids in Kamaishi were well prepared. That's part of their social infrastructure, see? They were well prepared. They knew what to do in this situation. And not only that, they maintained that attitude, that moral grit. Now this is in 2012 when I visited. Here, that's me. That's when I had dark hair. And I had hair. That was 2012. Akiko is the main character here, the woman in the middle. Fiery, energetic lady, big smile. And because of Akiko, she runs an inn called the Ryokan. She's an innkeeper. And this is at her inn, which just reopened when we visited in 2012. When the earthquake occurred, her inn was packed. And she knew the waves were going to be coming. So she went to all the rooms, screamed at her guests to go climb the hill in the back of her inn, because she had thought beforehand. She prepared, she paved, she cut down, she made her own path by hand to go up the hill behind her inn. She made her own path, and she told her guests to all climb up the path. Now some, because of the time, they were very close to the water. Some did not, on the 3rd floor, did not have time to get out. So they went up to the 4th floor. And her inn is up on a hill, actually, and we stayed at her inn. And the waves came up as far as the 3rd floor and wiped out her inn. So those on the 4th floor lived. She was up on the 4th floor with them. But at one point, she's screaming outside, telling her neighbors to go up to the hill behind her inn. A lot of the neighbors thought, what is this crazy woman, you know? But they didn't believe her. Those who did not heed her died. Those who did listen to her lived. And she herself was swept by the water. And she told me that she believed she was going to die because everything just turned black. And she tells me that she was struggling, she was hanging on to this branch, she could feel some branch, and a hand reached down and pulled her out. And she doesn't know to this day whose hand that was. But she was pulled out, and she, dripping wet, struggling, gasping for air, she climbed up to the 4th floor of her inn with her guests. So thanks to Akiko, the people at her inn and many of her neighbors lived. So that's an example of moral grit, right? Thinking of others first, right? Because she could have easily just thought of herself and her own staff. But she followed her duty, and her duty was to protect her guests. It's another character in my book, Bunzo, the man in the middle. He's got a contagious smile. Let me read you about Bunzo. I start off the chapter with this. What is deadlier? Baptism by fire or baptism by water? Immediately after the tsunami, fires swamped numerous coastal towns. From a distance, Bunzo Kanayama, a retired truck driver in the 60s who lived in Otsuchi, watched on a hill helplessly as waves swallowed his home and his neighborhood. His home, by the way, had his wife and daughter in it. He also watched as fires raged throughout his town. He spotted a powerful wave crushing storage tanks, holding petroleum. The wave shattered gasoline tanks, smashed cars, and spilled tons of fuel. Vessels of all sizes were swept ashore, colliding with overturned vehicles, and their oil and gasoline emptied into the sea of mud. Once the gasoline and oil burst into flames, the onrushing sea's hell turned into a raging inferno. Nearly everywhere, gasoline fires exploded. Hundreds of villagers rushed to one of the designated shelters, a popular Buddhist temple, about half a mile inland from the coast. They no doubt trusted in the Buddha's protection. That same temple saved them in the past. Yet no one was prepared for a tsunami of this massive force and height, and they probably didn't know what hit them, as the giant wave easily crushed them all to death. Within seconds, their temple became a fiery hell. Numerous casualties throughout the coast came from those who sought shelter in these designated evacuation sites.
After the surge, did the water retreat immediately and people then could come down to ground level?
In some places it did. In some places it did. Here, one wave came after the other in Otsuchi. But another place, because Otsuchi doesn't have any inlets, but in places where there are inlets, waves tended to recede out a bit and then come back again. So a lot rests upon the geography, the topography of the area. What we have is an unevenness of the casualties along the coast. Some places that were directly exposed to the sea coast, experienced fewer casualties than those in the inlets, which is amazing. And I think a lot of it has to do with the cohesiveness of the community beforehand. Here's an example. Years before this in Kobe, there was a terrible earthquake in Kobe, 1995. I was there, not in Kobe, but I was there in the northern part of Japan when this happened. And there were two cities that lived close to each other, Mano and Mikura. Fires were everywhere, just like in Otsuchi. Fires were everywhere. People in Mikura experienced more casualties. People in Mano, close by, experienced hardly any casualties. And the reason why is because the people in Mikura had no plan. They all fled in panic. They all fled in panic. The people in Mano organized neighborhood fire brigades. They knew their neighbors. They knew what to do. They had thought about it ahead of time, you see? And that's that social infrastructure, the cohesion that we have to have before it hits us. And the question, of course, we can ask is, do we have that? Do you have that where you live? Do you know your neighbors? And do they know you? And do they care about you? That's the big question. So Bunzo, after seeing his house taken by a wave, his wife and daughter killed, townspeople, he was in depression for some weeks, obviously. But then he took it upon himself to go out and he started planting these little flowers called nanohana flowers. And they're yellow. And the survivors saw this old man in the mud planting seeds, these flowers. And they were, what is he doing? Well, he was hoping that the seeds would turn into a yellow flower, and the yellow is the color of hope. It's a Buddhist color. And he was hoping that this would give hope to the people nearby. So young people started joining him. And next thing you know, you had this area that was usually before covered with bodies and debris and mud. Now this was in 2012, with nanohana flowers. And now, every year in April, there's what is called the annual Nanohana Festival. And people from all over Japan go to Otsuji to see this incredibly vast, huge field, this carpet of yellow nanohana flowers. And the whole point is that the yellow flowers designate hope. You know, there's a Spanish expression, hope dies last. And that's the idea, that's what Bunzo wanted to convey. Hope dies last, you know. We have to always keep our hope. So,
Houses in the background rebuilt?
yes, a lot of them are rebuilt. They weren't so devastated. We have the waves go through them, but a lot of the houses, because of their structure, weren't flattened by the waves. So they were wiped out on the interior, but then renovated on the inside. Right? This is further up, further inland, where Bunzo lived. They were flattened, and a lot of them are wooden houses. There's a lot to be said for stone houses. But on the other hand, in great earthquakes in Japan, it's the cement and the stone and the brick houses that were really the worst, that fell apart, especially the brick. The wooden houses tended to withstand earthquakes better, but not tsunamis, not waves. When it came to earthquakes, wooden houses are more flexible. Yeah, they're more flexible, the wood on the ground, because you're more give and take. The pagodas, for instance, they have a pendulum that keeps them. So think of all these centuries, the pagoda stands, right? And despite all the earthquakes. But wooden houses don't stand a chance when it comes to a tsunami, a wave. Plus, wooden houses are very hazardous in an earthquake because of the fire. You know, if you have a gas stove or cooking at that time, then fire is spread because of the wooden houses, so you have this terrible such situation. Anyway, here's an interesting story. This is a book that was sent to Bunzo. When I met with Bunzo in 2014, you know, I met with him, and he knew, of course, that my father was Irish, so he was so eager to see me because he wanted to show me this book. And what it is a photo album. And there's a class photo of a school in Northern Ireland, Carrickfergus Primary School. And you see the yellow flowers? They're over writing notes to Bunzo and to the Japanese. So you can see some of the notes there. One kid in the bottom. They're writing in Japanese characters because they're studying Japanese culture. One kid writes, "I wish it didn't happen." I hope you can rebuild your home soon. We send our good wishes and hopes for you. God bless. Good luck on building your town. Good luck for the future. Hello, hope things get better soon. So they're all well wishes from the kids in Ireland, grammar school, who are studying Japanese culture.